Good afternoon. This is Matthew Vance with the Holiness Heritage Sunday School Literature coming to you again with a new Sunday School lesson. I apologize I missed the last couple of weeks. I had a 30th wedding anniversary. I never dreamed I'd make it to 30 years, but we've been married, me and my wife Rhonda, for 30 years. So we were gone, went on an extended trip for our wedding anniversary. So I was not able to be here in the office to record the last two Sundays. So I apologize for that. And we'll try to get back on schedule and stay on schedule here for a while. Our lesson today is lesson number 2 for March 14th, 2021 from the Holiness Heritage Sunday School Literature. And this quarter we are going to be studying about just some various characters throughout the Bible. Not studying a particular book of the Bible, but studying some various characters throughout the Bible. And today we're going to be studying about a man by the name of Micaiah. And the title of the lesson is The Voice of Conscience. Our lesson theme today, God has always had some faithful followers, even in the midst of widespread sin. God's spokesman boldly proclaimed the truth without fear or favor. Our golden text is Acts chapter 24, verse 16. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Our lesson reading is 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 2 through 10. Verses 2 through 10 will be our lesson reading today. And I'm going to start at verse 2. And it came to pass in the 3rd year that Jehoshaphat the king of Judah came down to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel said unto his servants, Know ye that Ramoth in Gilead is ours, and we be still, and take it not out of the hand of the king of Syria. And he said unto Jehoshaphat, Wilt thou go with me to battle to Ramoth Gilead? And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as thou art, my people as thy people, my horses as thy horses. And Jehoshaphat said unto the king of Israel, Inquire, I pray thee, at the word of the Lord today. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said unto them, Shall I go against Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall I forbear? And they said, Go up, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hand of the king. And Jehoshaphat said, Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides, that we might inquire of him? And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, There is yet one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him. For he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. And Jehoshaphat said, Let not the king say so. Then the king of Israel called an officer and said, Hasten hither Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat the king of Judah sat each on his throne, having put on their robes, in a void place in the entrance of the gate of Samaria. And all the prophets prophesied before them. Now there's a lot more of this story that we're not reading. We didn't print in the quarterly for the sake of time, that we will cover and talk about as we go through the lesson today. So in this passage here, we meet a prophet of God that is definitely not as well known as Elijah or Elisha, but Micaiah was a courageous man of God. And, he was known by Ahab that he was a true messenger of God. And you know what I found out? I found out that sometimes we are fooled by people. Sometimes that we look at people and I'm thinking right now of some preachers that people in the holiness movement were fooled by them but sinners knew what they really were. They knew whether they were true or whether they were right or not. And sinners know whether you're a real man of God or not many, many times. And so Ahab had heard of Micaiah and had found out that he never gave in to the pressure of the false prophets, but he held true to the Word of God. And so in our lesson today, what we want to do is we want to liken Micaiah to the conscience. That word, that voice inside of us that tells us the truth even when we don't want to hear it. Even when others are around telling us different, the conscience still tells us the truth. We want to see that in our lesson today. And we live in a world where there's so much evil. You look at a newspaper or look on the internet and you hear news and you're shocked by it, by what people are doing, the crimes people commit, the terrible immoral lives. They feel no shame, no remorse, and you wonder what happened to their conscience. What happened to their conscience? And in our study today, we're going to look at how people treat their conscience, how they abuse their conscience, and how their conscience can be overridden. So first point of the lesson, the king had a plan. King Ahab here was famous for being very wicked, very idolatrous. He was an evil king. But if you'll notice, God even gave him mercy and allowed him to have victory over Syria. In 1 Kings chapter 20, Benhadad, king of Syria, came down, demanded that Ahab give him all of the treasures. And Ahab refused to do this. Syria came down, attacked Samaria. God sent a prophet to Ahab, promised him victory. Israel went out and slew the Syrians with a great slaughter. Benhadad himself escaped, and a year later he returned. God sent another prophet and offered Ahab victory, told him he could have victory. As wicked as he was, God was still working and dealing with Ahab. Well, Benhadad persuaded Ahab to make a covenant with him instead of killing him and get angered God. God wanted him to destroy this wicked Benhadad, but Ahab had made a covenant. Ahab had entered into an agreement with Benhadad. And so God sent the prophet back and said, because you didn't destroy him, I'm going to destroy you. Now, we enter a time in our text here today where Ahab had some time, about 3 years of peace, and was probably feeling pretty confident, wasn't as worried about the judgment of God that had been promised by the prophet. And so he looked now to go back and to take back Ramoth Gilead that had been taken by the Syrians earlier. And so he probably wanted to show his strength, restore the confidence of the people in him. And so he got to thinking, I ought to go back and take it back. I'm strong enough, I can do it. Well, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came to visit. When he was there, they got to talking, and he brought up the subject of going down and taking back Ramoth Gilead. And he asked Jehoshaphat, would you be willing to go? And Jehoshaphat said, yeah, I'll do it, absolutely. I'll bring my hosts, my men, and my servants, and we'll go help you take back Ramoth Gilead. Now, this man Jehoshaphat was not like Ahab. Ahab was a very wicked man. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings 22 and 43 that Jehoshaphat did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. He hadn't rebelled against God. He hadn't followed idols. And so he agrees, and I don't know, maybe something about this. The Bible talks about being unequally yoked with unbelievers. Maybe there was something about this that just checked Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat said, wait a minute, I want to make sure God's all right with this. I want to make sure that God is okay with me going with you. And you know what? A real Christian will learn to seek God's will in his life. I remember hearing a man years ago that he made this statement. He said, somebody said something about buying a car and praying whether I'd get the right car and it'd be God's will. And this man said, I don't pray about stuff like that. I feel like God gives me enough sense to know whether I ought to buy a car or not. And so I don't pray about whether I ought to buy a car or not. Well, not long after that guy said that, he started having the worst car problems of anybody I knew. I mean, everything started going wrong. He had every problem, a breakdown, everything that could happen. And I hope he learned his lesson that he ought to talk to God about it. When you make decisions in your life, you're going to buy a home, take a job, a career change, who you're going to date, who you're going to marry, what vehicle you're going to buy. In my own business, I run Vance Graphics. I run a print shop and a sign shop. And I have prayed many, many times for God's direction. Lord, should I buy this piece of equipment? Should I do that job? Should I go there? And I'm convinced if more people sought God for direction in their life, it would save them from a whole lot of trouble. I've watched as people have taken jobs that ended up taking them out of church. And I wondered, did they ever pray about that? I wonder, did they ever ask God about that? Did they get God's opinion on it? So listen, don't rely on your own intellect, your ability, but realize you must trust in the Lord, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. How many times are our plans not God's plans at all? We make a plan, we go here, we do that. But I tell you what, I've tried to learn to ask God. I've tried to learn in my life, what would God have me to do? What would God have? Ahab never thought about asking God's direction. Ahab he was concerned about how he would look. He was concerned about what would happen with him. And he never asked God's direction. But Jehoshaphat, being a man who lived for the Lord, said, I want to ask. I want to talk to God. Well, Ahab was a man who served Baal, a false god. So probably a lot of his prophets were prophets of Baal. They were advisors to the king. And so Ahab calls his 400 prophets together and asks them, shall we go up? And all of them with one accord said, go up. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king. Now, Jehoshaphat, he knew what kind of man Ahab was. He knew what kind of prophets these prophets probably were. And so Jehoshaphat rather said, now wait a minute. I want to know, is there not one that we can inquire of the Lord? You've got prophets of Baal. You've got your advisors. You've got all these that with one consent are saying, yes, go up, prosper. God's going to be with you. Is there not a prophet of the Lord? Can I not hear from God? Now remember, we're talking about our conscience here. And there are times that the world around you, the church world, everybody around you says, do it, go do it, you ought to go ahead. But how about hearing from God? How about checking in our conscience? You know, not everybody that claims to speak for God does. Not everybody. I was talking earlier to someone, and they said so-and-so did such and such, and they're a Christian. And I said, no, they're not a Christian. If they did what you said they did, they are not a Christian. Not everybody that claims to speak for God does, but Jehoshaphat had enough sense to realize, I need to hear from God. You're not going to find God's will at a fortune teller or a horoscope or reading Dear Abby or listening to Rush Limbaugh's Passed On Now, but you're not going to find God's will listening to Rush Limbaugh. You're going to find God's will in studying His Word, attending His house, hearing His minister, and walking in the Spirit. That's how you're going to hear God's will. And Jehoshaphat had enough sense to realize that all 400 of these could be leading us astray. How about a prophet of God? And Ahab knew there was one. He didn't like him. Micaiah, he didn't like him. He said, I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but he prophesies evil. Well, you know what I've heard people say about the preacher? I don't like that preacher. He always preaches on us. And I was talking to a kid the other day, and he said, I don't like this preacher. I don't like what he got up and told him. You can't drink beer and go to heaven. You got to get saved. He said, I don't really like that. He can't just tell people that they can't drink beer. And I said, well, I want to tell you why he tells them that. Because he knows God says it's wrong. And he knows that people that are going to do it are going to go to hell. And he cares enough to tell people the truth. Ahab didn't like Micaiah. He don't tell me what I want to hear. He doesn't prophesy good about me. Well, you know why I didn't prophesy good about him? Because there wasn't anything good to prophesy. And when I hear people say, preacher, and I know you can preach too hard. I know you can preach with a wrong spirit or a bad spirit or a bad attitude. But I want to tell you something. When I look at Jesus and I look at John the Baptist and I hear preaching like, ye generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come. When I hear preachers in the Bible that say you're a whited sepulcher, you know what? That's only offensive to people that are evil. When I hear a preacher that gets up and says, if you do this or you do that, you're going to go to hell, that's not offensive to me unless I'm doing that. Unless I'm the one that's getting, they say when you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps the loudest is the one that got hit. Well, Ahab said I don't like him. And there's a whole lot of people, they'd rather hear a preacher. There's TV preachers, TV prophets. There's people in your family that will tell you, it's all right. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to live that way because they don't want somebody that looks at them and tells them the truth. Tells them the truth. They don't want to hear that. So Ahab, Jehoshaphat said, don't judge him until you bring him. Come on, let's hear him. The false prophets sat in the gate. 400 prophets came in. Zedekiah took horns, like off of an animal, horns of iron, and began to walk around saying, thus saith the Lord, with these horns shall ye push Syria till you've consumed them. I mean, put on an illustrated sermon. You see these horns, that's how you're going to push. Go up and prosper. God's going to be with you. It was a unanimous decision, but they hadn't heard from God. I'm going to let you in a little secret. There's more false prophets than there are real prophets. There are more that will, they got their books and their videos and their tapes and their TV shows to impress you that if you'll just send me $100, I'll send you this blessed pocketbook that's got a penny in the corner and you'll never be broke again as long as you keep it. There's more of that type. There's more preachers that'll go around saying, live how you want and do what you want. And everything's going to be all right. God's pleased with you. But we hadn't heard from God yet. There's very few. You look at the Bible. Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. 400 prophets of Baal, I believe 450 prophets of the grove. And one man of God. One man standing for the truth. The messenger that went to get Micaiah, he was obviously pretty impressed with the show. He told him, don't cause any trouble. Come on, prophesy good. Go up and tell him it's going to be all right. How many times has a preacher been said, why do you got to keep preaching like that? Don't you know you're the only one that believes that anymore? Don't you? Hey, in my own family, don't you know you're the only preacher? You're the only person in your immediate family that still wants to live holiness and still wants to preach holiness. Don't you know that you're the only one that still believes in living for God and the pressure to compromise? Nobody else. Why, look how big the congregations are in the other churches. Look how well they're doing. Look how God is blessing them and prospering them. He encouraged Micaiah, come in and tell us something good. But the fourth point of the lesson is the man of God. And thank God for real men of God. Thank God for those that without fear or favor, thank God for those that will stand up for the truth and preach the word of God if nobody likes it. Now there's people look at Micaiah and say, oh, you are a hard preacher. You're out of line, preacher. You shouldn't have told them. But Micaiah had heard from God. He tells that messenger, I'm going to preach whatever God said regardless of what everybody wants to hear, regardless of what the prophets say. Ahab brought him in and said, should we go to battle, should we not? And I don't know, Micaiah, he might have had a little sarcastic streak in him. He looked at Ahab and he said, yeah, go up and prosper. Ahab wasn't no idiot. He knew Micaiah was being sarcastic, not telling him the truth. He knew that Micaiah was just saying, sure, yeah, do what they all said. Yeah, see how that works out for you. Go ahead. Go to battle. Let's see how that works. You just go ahead and obey. But Ahab looks at him and said, now tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. And you know what? People, even when they don't want to hear the truth, they still want to know that there's somebody willing to tell them the truth. They may look at you and say, don't preach at me. I don't want you preaching at me. I don't want you telling me the truth. But they still want to know that there's somebody that cares whether they're going to go to hell or not. There's still somebody that cares whether God loves them, whether God's going to demand they live right, whether God's going to demand that they repent. They still care. Micaiah looks at him and tells him the truth. He said, I see Israel scattered as sheep without a shepherd. I see that you're not going to be leading them, Ahab. They're going to be scattered. I see that. Of course, Ahab got upset, looked at Jehoshaphat and said, see, I told you. I told you he would never prophesy prophesy something good about me. He never tells me what I want to hear. I recently talked to some people that went to a very worldly church, and they had a preacher come in that started preaching against some things. Really, I thought any Christian ought to live. And they said, we don't like it. Liable to be a church split over this. We don't like that preaching, him telling us we can't do that. Ahab asked for the truth, but he really didn't want to hear it. The Bible says, buy the truth and sell it not, but how many people really want to know the truth? Micaiah tells a parable about a vision, a lying spirit that came into the mouth of those false prophets. Old Zedekiah walks up, gets so mad he punches Micaiah. But there was a false spirit, a lying spirit, that said, I can deceive them. I'll go in the mouth of the prophet and I'll deceive them. And I'm afraid today that there are way too many preachers under the influence of a lying spirit. I believe there's way too many people that are under the influence of a lying spirit. Ahab got mad, told him, said, I'm going to feed you bread of affliction, nothing but bread and water. I'm going to put you in the prison, in the dungeon, until I return in peace. You say that they'll be scattered. You say God won't help us. I've got 400 prophets that say they will. I've got one that says they won't. These 400 prophets, we'll let them eat the fine stuff. We'll put you in prison. You know what? People don't treat the preacher very good when he tells them the truth. People sure don't treat him very well. They put him in prison. Ahab said, I'm going to battle. His confidence was shaken. He knew that that preacher told him the truth. Just like some of you know the preachers told you the truth. Oh, Ahab knew. So Ahab disguised himself, went to the battle. And a man in the battle just shot a bow to venture. Pulled back that bow and arrow and let it go. Let that arrow fly. That arrow went up in the air, arched. God knew where it was going. It came down and smote Ahab between the joints of the harness. Sounded like right in the middle of the back. Came down and the arrow went in. They drove Ahab out of the battle. And that evening Ahab died in his chariot. A rebel to the very end. He refused to listen to the voice of God, to the voice of his conscience. Now, what's some lessons we can learn from this? I'm going to wrap this up here. In every man, there's a God-given conscience. You read Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. The Gentiles, which have not the law, do by the nature the things in the law. Their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts accusing or else excusing one another. Paul there in Romans is telling that law was written in their hearts. There is something God has put in us called a conscience that tells us whether what we're doing is right or wrong. In John chapter 8, they brought a woman to Jesus taken in the act of adultery. He reached down and wrote in the ground. He looked up, the accusers were gone, and they all went out convicted by their own conscience. Their own conscience told them, we're condemning this woman. Where's the man she was committing adultery with? Maybe it was even one of them that were there that day. But they were condemning the sinful woman. But he said, he without sin cast the first stone. And their own conscience told them, convicted them. Your conscience is there to convict you, but your conscience may be overridden. It gives guidance, but it doesn't control you. Like a warning light on the dashboard of a car tells you if the oil's low or your tire pressure's low or if you're about to run out of gas. But you know what? I saw a really, really nice vehicle the other day sitting by the side of the road with a AAA guy there with a gallon of gas, pouring gas in it. I'm talking a nice car, nice vehicle. One of them that would have told them 5 miles to empty, 2 miles to empty, 1 mile to empty, and they ignored it. You can ignore your conscience. You can override your conscience. You can obey it and do right, or you can ignore it and do wrong. You remember when Moses was going to kill the Egyptian, he saw smiting the Israelite. He looked this way and that way. His conscience told him what I'm doing is wrong. His conscience said, look, make sure nobody's watching. Samson, when he was with Delilah, his conscience told him, don't do what you're doing. Judas, when he was betraying the Lord, his conscience told him, what you're doing is wrong. You can override it. You don't have to listen. Number 3, your conscience can be defiled. The Bible talks about those who have defiled their conscience. They have corrupted it, distorted it. And number 4, you can sear your conscience. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1, the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisies, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. Having their conscience seared. In the Civil War, get an arm shot off or a leg, they would amputate, cut it off. Didn't have good medical equipment. They would cauterize the stump by taking a red hot iron, pushing it against it, and burning those nerve endings and stopping the feeling and stopping the bleeding. You can have your conscience seared with a hot iron. So, Brother Vance, I don't feel bad about that anymore. Did you used to? Well, Brother Vance, it doesn't bother me. Brother Vance said, I've watched so many people walked away from holiness and said, I feel such liberty, I feel such freedom. I no longer feel convicted for the way I live. Did you ever? You've seared your conscience. You've allowed your conscience to become seared with a hot iron. You've allowed yourself to listen to the voice of the 400. You've taken, like they did in Micaiah, put him in a prison. I won't have to hear you down there. I can shut you up. I can put you down in a hole in the ground. I can stop what you're saying. I don't have to listen to you anymore. But the conscience still told him the truth. And Ahab died that day. Those 400 told him everything was all right. Yeah, they were wrong. The conscience still told the truth. And your conscience, that adultery you're committing, your conscience tells you it's wrong. That alcohol you're drinking, your conscience tells you that's wrong. Those drugs you're taking, your conscience tells you that's wrong. That way you're dressing, that way you're living, those things you're doing, those places you're going, your conscience tells you that's wrong. You can sear it and ignore it and end up like Ahab. I don't want to do that. Years ago, there was a ship named the Glendale, had a load of iron ore, and it was cruising up the coastline, and it wrecked on the coastline, and everybody couldn't figure out why the accident was. The captain knew the coastline. The crew had a compass. They had went through that place many, many times, and they knew when you reach this point, turn so many degrees and follow the compass, and you'll be clear. Well, they did some investigation, and what they found out was the iron ore that was in that ship. They didn't normally carry iron ore, but the iron ore in that ship had thrown the compass off. And they thought they were on an accurate course, but the iron ore, when they thought they were going north, they weren't going north at all. And they wrecked that ship. And if you allow yourself to override your conscience, you'll find out you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be in trouble. The voice of conscience, let's listen to it. All right. Lord bless you. We plan on seeing you next Sunday. Have another lesson coming up that we'll teach next Sunday on Nicodemus seeking for salvation. All right. Lord bless you. Have a good day.